Beef Market Update with Anne Dunford on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Haney Farms. Do you need seed? Find us at HaneyFarms.com. It's time for another edition of the Beef Market Update with Anne Dunford. Welcome today, Anne.
Hey, Shaun.
Okay, Anne, it's happy belated Canada Day. It's July 2nd. How was your Canada Day weekend?
It was very good. And actually, just for the record, it's the 3rd.
Oh, it's the 3rd. How quickly someone loses track of time. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's talk about some good news first, because we're always looking for good news in the cattle market, especially when you look at the cash market as of late. The WTO ruled again in favor of Canada in the U.S. appeal on COOL. So what does this mean?
Well, Shaun, I mean, good news. I mean, we were very, I think, confident about the position, especially on the live cattle and hog discrimination, and so that was most certainly upheld in this last ruling. And again, good news is good news, but this is WTO, and things don't move quickly in that front. So the procedures from here, we should know in about a month. I think the timelines of what's going to happen, but it could take quite some time, depending on how the U.S. decides to go, what angle they decide to go in regards to changing the current legislation. You would think that this will give some confidence to U.S. cattle feeders in regards to buying Canadian cattle to go in their feed yards. But at the same time, until the legislation changes, there's no knowing. So it's still a bit of time. But again, we're heading the right direction. But again, don't forget, this is WTO, and how quickly the U.S. moves to remove or change the legislation.
Does it really mean anything?
Well, once it does, Shaun, it sure does. But again, I think that's, you don't get the cart ahead of the horse here. I mean, when you can start to see Nebraska feedlots stepping in to buy Canadian feeder cattle, it should help basis levels on feeder cattle by all means. We've seen what basis levels have done since COOL came into play on feeder cattle. You're going to see it change, especially I think on the hog side, and on the fat cattle side, you should see more plants willing to take cattle and things like that. But those segregation rules have to change before those plants are going to change their buying practices. So it's good news, but hard to put a timeline about when it actually means money in our pockets.
Well, explain something to me. So the ruling comes out. We've got a quote here from NCBA. Bob McCann, Vice President of NCBA. We've got the National Pork Producers Council coming out and saying, great, hopefully this is a push in the direction of getting Obama to change the legislation. These are the producer organizations in the U.S. who COOL was supposedly supposed to protect at the beginning. They're saying they want it changed, yet the government is not willing to really listen to them to this point. What's going on here?
Well, frustrating. And I mean, that's been the case since day one. I mean, a lot of these organizations have most certainly said, hey, you're just adding cost to our industry that's struggling from a margin perspective already. You're impacting our two biggest trading partners, that being Canada and Mexico. And so, again, frustrating. But the fact of the matter is, Shaun, it's not all of the organizations that the federal government's listening to, and you've got the groups like RCAF or some consumer groups, and of course, the argument from Canada's perspective hasn't been, we don't want the U.S. to be able to tell consumers what's in their products. So
yeah, but Anne, let's be honest, RCAF is a stock, it's a stock growers group of people or ranchers in Montana. Like, so, that group can't be allowed to hold up national organizations like, National Pork Producers and NCBA, can they?
Well, I think there's more than the one, I guess, would be my point. And secondly, you've got lots of consumer groups past the producer group that have been pushing on this as well. So I think it's a lot more complicated than just saying NCBA and the Canadian or the U.S. pork producers have been on side with getting rid of COOL, or most certainly changing it to a voluntary law. So there's so many prongs to this one. The bottom line is there's lots coming out and saying good for this the ruling on this appeal, but there's still lots out there saying we have to uphold some parts of this legislation. So who knows what's going to happen at the end of the day.
Does the U.S. hold this over us during the TPP negotiations, or are those two things mutually exclusive of each other?
I think exclusive, but Shaun, but it'd be interesting to see what some of the experts would say on that one. But again, interesting timing when it all comes together.
And timing not in Canada's favor.
Right.
So let's move on to a bit of an uglier story. The cash market. So talking to producers, we've got people selling cash cattle last week for 105. We've got people selling contracted cattle for 121. Boy, risk management looks like it really paid off in the summer of 2012.
Yeah, and again, you've used two obvious extremes, so I think, but nevertheless, extremes tend to tell the story, and this is the case, and we've talked about it for quite some time now, Shaun. Not even just this winter, but even going back a year ago. How risk management, I think now, for some time, but more than ever before, has really got to be focused on. You're talking, if you were running a cash-to-cash kind of outfit at a feed yard in southern Alberta today, these cattle could be losing upwards of $200. So going forward, how do we manage inventory going forward from here? You've been watching, like all of us, what's going on with this U.S. Corn market, given these hot, dry conditions at a critical time for the corn crop. And so, of course, corn prices are taking off as we speak. We had the nearby shoot up over $7 a bushel this morning. And that is having, obviously, a negative price impact on the feeder cattle futures market and the U.S. cash market. So what happens here is this, are we going to see cattle feeders buy feeder cattle cheaper to get them in line and make them work, especially given these big losses that we're seeing this summer? Or did the tight supplies of feeder cattle keep the rein in the cow calf or the backgrounders' hands? So lots of unknowns, but I guess the bottom line would be I think you'd better have a pretty sharp pencil and a very good plan if you're going to step into what could be your most expensive inventory you've ever seen.
Yeah, two things working against Canadian feeders heading into fall. One is the high amount of Canadian feeder cattle that are potentially going to go south here. Some even speculating that there's been more forward contracting of those feeder cattle than we really even are expecting. And what was my other one? That was maybe that was only one. That was the only point, is that there are going to be extremely tight supplies of feeder cattle in the fall time.
Well, there will be now, of course, compared to, say, a month ago when we weren't, I wasn't really expecting $7 corn. This situation has probably alleviated that concern a little bit, depending on what happens as we head into fall. If corn's going to stay that high, most certainly it's going to make it not as competitive from a feed cost perspective as what we were expecting. Secondly, and this might have been what you were thinking about, is, of course, we've had the dollar move back up from where we were for the last few weeks in here. And if Europe has kind of figured things out for now and there's less kind of perceived risk out there in the world today, of course, the stronger Canadian dollar has been another kind of negative as far as what feeder cattle prospects might be this fall. So things are constantly changing, and just to kind of run by the seat of your pants, whether it's grain, fat cattle, or this Canadian dollar, and then the basis on top of it, we got a pile of things that are really volatile at this time.
Are you still expecting a pretty good bounce back in the live cattle price this fall?
I think we will, but I'm hesitant to really nail it down until we see how this corn thing settles out. Granted, this is the heat of summer, the height of summer, and the heat of the hot. And I guess we'll see what happens as we get towards harvest and all the rest of it. But at this point in time, it's got to be a concern. And I still want to remain bullish feeder cattle prices and fat cattle prices going into later this year, early next year, just based on tight supplies. But at the same time, these costs are skyrocketing.
In order to participate in this market as a feeder, you have to be hoping for higher prices. Because what's happening is, like we talked about many times, is that higher prices don't mean higher profits.
Right, and that's the bottom line. Here we've got a great, historically a pretty good market, and we're losing $200 a head. So, and they're at negative positions in the U.S. as well. So again, frustrating. So you can't just look at one piece of this puzzle. There's several prongs that we haven't got all figured out just yet.